So again, as I was talking about, the interesting thing here is how we pass down our lineage. Actually, you're going to see in the case study, and I don't want to give too much away, um, that with the Unangans, you find a more status-driven household, and it tends to be because it's patrilineal. And we'll talk about that in a second. Groups in the Arctic tended to live with nuclear families, also with extended families as well, so grandparents. Um, and they lived within their nuclear families and split up kind of in smaller groups during certain times of the year, and then got back together in these band level groups at different times a year. Um, so the majority of them, again, I've been talking about kind of the Aleuts and how they were not necessarily um, matrilineal kinship structure. They Most of the Arctic peoples organize themselves in a bilateral kinship structure, which is how we in the United States do it, which means we have aunts and uncles on both sides, our mom and dad. We have cousins on both sides. Matrilineal only would, and this is unilineal kinship, would be that you only basically find that your relatives are on your mother's side. Patrilineal, father's side. And again, the fascinating piece here is that when we see patrilineal descent systems, we tend to have more status within these groups. If you have bilateral or matrilineal, we tend to have less status and hierarchy of power. All right, so also arranged marriages were the most common way of forming marriage. However, there were exceptions to this, and you'll discover that this is true in everything that we talk about in anthropology. I may talk about, say, band level groups being mostly egalitarian. This is not universal, as you've just discovered when we talk about the Unangans and their hierarchy of status in terms of male, passing down a scribe status as headmen to their sons. But in general, we do talk about generalities just because, again, it kind of opens itself up to conversation in terms of power and concepts, right? But you're going to see that most things are not universal, and even in our society in the 1950s and 40s, divorce was not common, right? So we could say things like divorce it wasn't around, but in reality, were there exceptions and was there divorce? Yes, right. So constantly be in the back of your mind, well, there was probably some group of people that operated a little bit differently, and even certain tribes and band levels had their own versions of things. Remember, I think I went through this with some of you in terms of your discussion posts and talked about the spectrum idea and ethnocentrism and cultural relativity. Everything is on a spectrum to a certain degree as well. Egalitarian to hierarchies would also be this spectrum. And you're going to have groups that maybe feel more band level and egalitarian, but they also then are kind of more on this version of hierarchy and status, like I just talked about. So remember, think of a lot of these concepts, even when I talk about them maybe in generalities, realize that they're on a spectrum. And every single arrangement in terms of sociopolitical, every single kind of technology, every single kind of economy has been tried at some point in human history and continues to be retried or mixed and matched together again to form these new versions of culture and society. So just kind of keep that in mind as well. Children were very highly valued. And like all societies, children mean the next generation, right? However, your book definitely goes into, and when I was kind of an early anthropologist, infanticide was something that happened more often than not with these groups. And again, remember in early times, especially in these band level, tribal level groups, the maintenance of the tribe itself was the most important, which is you have to have enough food to feed the adults and the children that are already in that tribe. Although children are valued for the next generation, if they were born with severe disabilities or there was a time of famine, infanticide most of the time happened. Your book points out that the women tended to not do this. act because there was a lot of taboos on women even hunting. So women were seen as the life providers or the life givers, and men were seen as the death dealers. And has direct correlation with the hunt. If men go out and take life, then they should also be the responsible ones to take life if has to do with humans and infanticide. Typically, infanticide, killing infants, was more about nature killing infants, and many times they were left in the cold, left behind, left outside, those kinds of things. And again, we see these things as a very cultural issue and taboo. So when we hear this word, we think, oh, this is not okay. And again, this is for the survival of the group. And I'm not saying that it's okay because I have my own cultural bias in the United States that I've been raised with. However, realizing the function of it is important. Okay. And again, because the infant doesn't have value in terms of production for the group survival currently, it falls lowest on the importance list in a time of famine. Okay. Infants were cared for by mothers, and you see in this picture on the slide, and they were carried in their parkas. Usually they were naked, and there was a lot of skin-to-skin contact. This ended up forming a strong bond with the mother, and they also had very strong bonds with the grandparents. Children had freedom up to age 5 or 6. For us, this feels funny. 5 or 6 seems very young, but at that time they would then be expected to start to learn some of the trades of their mother and father. Boys would start to be taught how to shoot a bow and arrow and to hunt, or to fish, and women would be taught to process meat and cook and all of those other things. It was kind of a move into adulthood at this age. Now remember, here's the interesting part as well. We in the United States don't tend to even be called adults until 18, and aren't really even considered adults until we hit 30s, it seems like. And again, I'm going on kind of my own personal experiences in terms of how other adults treat people. But these individuals in this Arctic kind of environment, 5 or 6 was moving into you better learn your trade, because at about 14 to 16, you are going to be a full-fledged adult. So you have about 10 years to kind of discover what that adulthood is like. And it's almost like we do this a little bit too. That 18 to 28 year range is like a 10-year range, but we start very late compared to this group, and where survival is key, right? A lot of times these band level groups were what we hear first, and then we have a really hard time knowing what exactly went on politically, because a lot of tribes and chiefdoms were forced upon groups by colonial governments. So people would show up, and they would expect a male leader to come forward to do the negotiations, which then caused a chief or a chiefdom to arise out of a egalitarian society. So again, a lot of the ethnographic data has to be caveated with this may have not been the way that it was always, right? Conflicts did arise usually out of jealousy of women. This is fascinating as well. I would say that this is pertinent in a lot of cultures and societies. Conflicts were usually resolved through wrestling and singing. Okay, so one man would do a song, the other man would do a song, and then the group would basically judge who won. And it wouldn't matter if the loser lost. It would usually be at least I was defending my honor kind of thing. Wrestling, punching, those kinds of things happened as well. However, the book points out that most of the time these were not resolved through violent conflict. Now, if a conflict wasn't able to be resolved, then a lot of times your book points out that either they banished the individual, which meant certain death, to be honest, or they killed the individual to end the social conflict. Because remember, getting along and cooperating is the goal of this group. Again, singing would be a form of ritual war in a way, so this is kind of an interesting one as well. Warfare was usually non-violent as well, and was considered a supernatural event and involving shamans. However, your book also talks about total warfare, where groups would possibly go in and raid whole villages and kill all people off. Now, again, the tough part here is that your book doesn't really put this into context. The author states that warfare was uncommon, but you can pretty much guess that warfare tended to happen more often during times of famine, right? So if it was a a super harsh winter, and they had lower numbers of seal life, bird life, fish, all of those things. If these groups of people could not access foodstuffs, then the perception and the reality of resource scarcity, this gets into Marx's conflict theory, resource scarcity starts to force people into these relationships with other groups. And these do some interesting things in terms of psychology with people. If we're hungry and we're not eating, we're going to start to create and work into our own cultural dialogue about how the group next to us or the tribe down the road is not who they say they are, and they are actually evil people. And the shamans could start backing this up by saying, yes, they're casting evil spirits on us. Next thing you know, you have a war party going into total war. We can see the kind of cultural materialistic, the energy effect of living in this kind of environment causing this total war concept. Now, again, we'll get more into symbolic and ritual war when we talk about the California natives, where resources were abundant and you never had to really fear that this was going to happen. So again, total war was not a thing here. Up there, more likely, right? Because of this resource perception and reality, really. Some other interesting things that this group practiced: wife sharing. Open is almost in a sense an open marriage. It created a broader kinship structure, which is seen as a positive, where you could kind of go for extra support if you needed more food or you needed kind of extra work. In terms of taking care of the group, right? So it did these things. It also created, your book says things like variety and mates and those kinds of things. And I don't know if they're definitely not a basic need, but it was a perception usually of males in this group. But wife sharing was considered a kind of common practice. However, the women had to agree to it. Sex was not hidden from the children. So again, many times kids, and there was co-sleeping, right? Kids were in the same bed as the parents, and parents would have sex. It didn't matter if the kids were there. Again, very different. We have taboos around these things in our culture, and they did not. So children ultimately learn and experiment with sex at a younger age because they're watching their parents do it, and it's not seen as a bad thing. Entertainment and games, singing, dancing, all of those things. Tug of rope. They tossed people up in the air when people would, or especially kids, would hang out on these skins and kind of throw them up in the air like a trampoline. They had a lot of fun and a lot of leisure time. Remember, if it's cold and freezing outside and you have enough meat and food already kind of gathered, then you're good to go, and ultimately leisure time takes over. So dancing, food, singing, entertainment, those kinds of things were very common. Euthanasia and suicide were also very common. Many times the elderly would just, when they knew it was their time and they were hindering a group, whether it be they start to break down in terms of not being able to move because these groups moved a lot. They would just either wander off by themselves, leave themselves in the elements, stay behind when the group was leaving. Sometimes they would ask relatives to kill them off. And this suicide and euthanasia were not seen as negatives. They were seen as individuals kind of admitting to the processes of life, and it was an honorable way to go, especially when you were older in life. And this is going to touch on some of the religious ideology in terms of reincarnation, and we'll talk more about that. But yeah, so euthanasia. Again, family members may have been asked to do this, and it was probably the men, right? Because they are the dealers of death, according to many of these groups. And suicide were definitely part of this. So we see that infants who are not able to necessarily produce or help a group feed the group for survival, and elderly. So those kinds of tops and bottom tiers in times of famine or in harsh kind of natural environment realities tended to create what we would have big taboos around issues of infanticide and suicide. And again, these groups saw them as practical for survival, for the group's survival, and saw them as kind of just important ideas, and would not even see them as wrong.